It was a Sunday evening in July 1968, and the late afternoon was gradually softening into evening across Memphis, Tennessee, with warm summer air drifting through the open window of Elvis Presley's Cadillac as he drove slowly through the neighborhood where he had grown up, a part of the city where white and black communities had always lived in close proximity to one another, where music had always managed to cross the invisible lines that the rest of society tried so hard to maintain. Elvis had no particular destination that evening, just driving through familiar streets with the window down, letting the warm air move through the car, when he heard it. Voices, multiple voices harmonizing together, floating down the street and reaching him clearly even from a distance. It was gospel music, and not the polished, smoothed-out version that ended up on the radio. This was the genuine article, the kind of singing that came from people who had been raised in church, who had learned to lift their voices to God long before they ever thought about singing for any other audience. Elvis eased off the gas and followed the sound, turning slowly down the street it was coming from, and as he got closer the individual voices separated themselves out clearly enough for him to identify each one. There was a bass voice so deep and low that Elvis could feel it in his chest as much as hear it with his ears. There was a baritone sitting underneath that, warm and smooth, filling in all the spaces the other voices left open. Above those two was a tenor, clean and bright and soaring. And weaving through all of them was a lead voice that carried the melody and the full emotional weight of the words, telling the story of the song in a way that made you believe every syllable of it. Elvis turned the corner and found the source of all of it. Standing on a street corner near a small neighborhood grocery store were four black teenagers, probably somewhere between 15 and 17 years old, dressed in their Sunday clothes, clean slacks and button-up shirts with their ties loosened but still around their necks, clearly just back from church and still carrying the music of the service with them. All four of them had their eyes completely closed. They were not performing for anyone or hoping someone would drop money in a hat. There was no hat, no cup, nothing like that at all. They were simply singing because the spirit of the music had them and they were not ready to let it go just because the formal service had ended. Elvis guided the Cadillac quietly to the curb about 30 feet away from where they were standing and turned off the engine. He sat there with the window down and he listened, really listened, the way a person listens when something stops them completely in their tracks. The song they were singing was an old gospel standard that Elvis recognized from his own childhood growing up in the Assembly of God Church. But these boys were doing something with it that he had not heard in years. They had that deep Mississippi sound in them, the kind that gets passed down from one generation to the next, learned in churches and on front porches and absorbed by ear and by heart over a lifetime of Sundays. The bass was the foundation of everything, so solid and steady it felt like the ground beneath the song. The baritone wrapped texture and warmth around that foundation. The tenor climbed above them both and hit notes so clean and precise they seemed to stay hanging in the air for a moment after they were sung. And the lead voice held it all together, making every word feel lived in and true, making Elvis feel like he was right there inside that church feeling exactly what the song was asking him to feel. Elvis closed his own eyes and sat with it. This was the sound that had shaped him as a young person, the sound he used to chase as a boy growing up in Tupelo and then Memphis, standing outside black churches too shy to walk in but completely unable to walk away from the music coming through the walls. This was the sound that had taught him more about what it meant to sing from somewhere real inside yourself than any formal lesson ever could have. He was 11 years old again for a moment, standing outside the First Assembly of God Church in Tupelo, listening to the congregation and feeling something in that music that made him feel like the world was larger and more alive than he had understood. These four boys on this Memphis street corner were creating that exact same feeling. He could feel goosebumps on his arms despite how warm the evening was. This was not just skilled singing. This was something that went beyond skill. These boys had been given a genuine gift, and when they opened their mouths and sang, that gift poured out of them in a way that was completely natural and completely without pretense. They finished the first song and moved into a second one without barely pausing, their four voices locking back together like they had never separated, each one exactly where it needed to be. Their bodies swayed slightly with the rhythm they were creating together. Their eyes stayed closed. They were somewhere else while they sang, carried there by the music itself. Elvis glanced around at the street. A few people nearby had noticed the boys, but most were simply going about their evening. A woman sitting on her porch was nodding along gently and smiling. An older man in a car slowed for a moment to listen and then kept driving. In a neighborhood where gospel music was part of the everyday fabric of life, nobody was stopping to make a fuss. But Elvis recognized something in what he was hearing that the people passing by were not stopping long enough to recognize. That particular quality of harmony, That natural, effortless blend where four voices come together and create something that sounds like a single instrument was not something anyone could teach. Either it existed between a group of people or it did not. With these four boys, it existed completely. They finished the second song and moved into a third, this one more upbeat and joyful than the first two, the energy rising as their voices lifted and chased each other through the melody before coming back together in perfect unison and then pulling apart again in beautifully interlocking patterns. They were smiling now even with their eyes still closed, feeling the music move through them and clearly loving every second of it. Elvis sat in that car through all three songs, a total of about 15 minutes, without moving. He barely shifted in his seat. He just listened and let the music take him back to every church he had ever stood outside of or sat inside of as a boy, back to the sounds and the tradition that had made him understand what music was really for and what it was really capable of doing to a person. When the third song ended, the boys opened their eyes, laughing and breathing a little hard the way people do after they have poured themselves into something, visibly happy and still glowing from wherever the music had taken them. One of them said something to the others that Elvis could not make out from where he was sitting, and they all laughed together. The intensity of the moment they had shared was breaking and releasing them back into the ordinary world. That was when Elvis opened his car door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. He stood about 30 feet away from them in his casual clothes, jeans and a button-up shirt, next to his white Cadillac. For a moment none of the boys noticed him because they were still caught up in talking and laughing with each other. Then the tallest one, the boy who sang bass, happened to glance over in Elvis's direction. His eyes went wide and his mouth fell open and he grabbed the arm of the boy next to him and pointed. The others turned to look one by one and the laughter stopped as each of their expressions shifted from relaxed and happy to completely stunned and disbelieving. One of them started to say something and stopped. Another whispered that it could not be. A third one said out loud, his voice climbing with the shock of it, whether that was really Elvis Presley standing there. Elvis smiled and started walking toward them, and at that point the street itself began to take notice. The woman on her porch stood up from her chair. A man who had been walking by stopped completely in his tracks. A driver slowed his car down and stared. Elvis reached the boys and told them good evening and said what he had just heard was beautiful, just genuinely beautiful. The boys stood completely still looking at him as though they were not entirely sure what they were seeing was real. The shortest one, who sang tenor, looked as though he might need to sit down. The lead singer finally found his voice and asked whether Elvis had actually heard them. Elvis told him he had heard them from a full block away, that he had pulled over and listened through all three songs because he could not bring himself to drive away. He told them they sang like people who had been doing it their whole lives. The bass singer said they had been, that they had both started in church when they were very small. Elvis said he could hear that what they were doing was genuine church singing and the real thing. He asked them their names. The bass singer was James. The baritone was Robert. The tenor was Thomas. The lead singer was Marcus. Elvis looked at them and asked whether they had ever considered recording. The boys looked at one another, not quite sure how to respond to the question. James repeated the word recording like he was trying to make sure he had heard it correctly. Elvis told them that their voices, that particular harmony they had together, was something people deserved to hear, that what they had was a genuine gift. Marcus said quietly that they just sang for God, that they sang in church and sometimes out on the street when the Spirit moved them, and that they were not professional by any stretch. Elvis told him that what they had was better than professional, because professional was something that could be learned and practiced, but what these four boys had was something natural and real that could not be replicated through training. By this time a small crowd had started gathering around them on the sidewalk, people recognizing Elvis and drifting closer, whispering to one another, some approaching carefully so as not to interrupt whatever was happening. Elvis noticed but kept his full attention on the four boys in front of him. He told them he had a friend who ran a recording studio that focused primarily on gospel music, and that this friend was always looking for voices that were the real thing. He asked whether they would be interested in meeting him and possibly recording a demo. The boys looked at one another in complete silence for a moment. Thomas, the tenor, had tears forming in his eyes. Robert was the first one to speak, and his voice was careful and steady as he asked Elvis whether he was being completely serious about this. Elvis told him he was absolutely serious and that he did not offer things he did not mean. He said they had something special and that the world should get to hear it. Marcus struggled to put words together and finally said that they were just kids from the neighborhood, that they were not famous, that they were nobody. Elvis stopped him right there and said firmly that they were not nobody, that they were four young men who had been given a gift by God, and that gifts like that were not meant to be kept to themselves. He asked them plainly whether they were interested or not. All four of them said yes at exactly the same moment, and even in those two words their voices formed an accidental harmony that made Elvis smile. He told them what was going to happen. He was going to give them a phone number, and they were going to call the next morning and ask for a man named James Blackwood. They were going to tell him Elvis had sent them, and James would set up a time for them to come in and record. He told them to bring their Sunday clothes and bring those voices, because that was truly all they needed. He took a piece of paper and a pen from his pocket, wrote down the number, and handed it to Marcus. Marcus looked at the paper and said the name James Blackwood out loud, recognizing it as the name of a well-known gospel singer. Elvis confirmed it was the same man, said he was a personal friend, and that he would take good care of them. Thomas asked Elvis in a shaking voice why he was doing this for them. Elvis looked at these four young black teenagers standing on a street corner in Memphis in 1968 in their Sunday clothes, singing gospel for the pure love of it with nobody watching and nothing to gain, and he thought about his own childhood and about the black musicians and gospel quartets that had shaped everything he had become as an artist, about the hours he had spent as a young boy standing outside churches listening to the music pouring out through the walls and windows, hungry for it in a way he could not fully explain even to himself. He told them that when he was young he used to stand outside churches and listen to people sing just like they had been singing, and that music had changed the direction of his entire life. It had shown him what he wanted to be and had taught him what music was truly capable of doing inside a person. He said they were carrying that tradition forward, and that somebody needed to make sure the rest of the world had a chance to hear what they were doing with it. The crowd gathered around them had grown to about 20 people by this point, and some of them were wiping tears off their faces and some were smiling wide, and all of them had heard what Elvis said. One of the older women in the crowd called out a blessing to him, and he nodded to her and then turned back to the boys and told them to call that number the next morning without fail. All four of them promised together. He told them to keep singing no matter what and never to stop, because the world needed voices like theirs. He shook each of their hands, then walked back to his Cadillac as the crowd made room for him. As he got into the car and started the engine he could see in his rearview mirror that people had gathered around the four boys and were congratulating them, and he could see Marcus holding the piece of paper up and the boys showing it to the people around them, explaining what had just happened. Elvis pulled away from the curb smiling. Those boys had something genuinely special, and now they were going to have the chance to do something with it. All four teenagers did exactly what Elvis had told them to do. The very next morning they crowded around the phone at Marcus's house, all of them so nervous their hands were not entirely steady. And they called the number. When James Blackwood heard that Elvis had sent them, the entire tone of the conversation changed immediately. He told them that Elvis did not send people to him unless they were the real thing, and he asked them when they could come in. They went to the studio that same week. Walking through the door of a professional recording studio for the first time in their lives was intimidating in a way none of them had words for. But the moment they started singing, all of that fell away. The fear and the nervousness simply left them, and they were just four boys doing what they had been doing since they were small children, singing gospel with everything they had in them. They recorded 3 songs that day. When James Blackwood sat and listened to the playback afterward, tears came to his eyes. He told them Elvis had been right, that they had something he had not heard in years, and he asked them right there on the spot whether they would be interested in making a record. They thought he was not being serious, but he was completely serious. He signed them to a recording deal that same afternoon. Within 6 months they had recorded their first full album. Within a year they were traveling and performing at churches across the South, singing to crowds of thousands of people. Within 5 years they had become one of the most respected gospel quartets in the entire country, with albums selling consistently and their voices reaching people all the way across America. Not one of them ever forgot the Sunday evening when Elvis Presley happened to be driving past a street corner in Memphis with his window down and heard 4 teenagers singing with their eyes closed, completely lost in the music and completely unaware that anyone was listening. They never forgot how he stopped the car and got out and walked over to them, how he looked them in the eyes and told them they had a genuine gift, how he opened a door that none of them had ever imagined would open for people like them. In a 1985 interview, Marcus, the lead singer, talked about that evening and what it had meant to all of them. He said they had been out there singing purely because they loved to sing and because the Spirit had moved them to keep going after church ended, and that they had no idea Elvis was anywhere near them until they finished and opened their eyes and found him standing beside his car on the street like it was the most natural thing in the world. He said Elvis did not have to pull over, did not have to get out of the car, and certainly did not have to go out of his way to help 4 unknown teenagers from a Memphis neighborhood. But he did all of it because he heard something real and he recognized it for what it was, and because he believed that kind of gift was not meant to stay on a street corner.